Thank you all for your continued support. If you found this content valuable, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement truly helps us. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. In the beginning, when humanity was young and the world still bore the fresh imprint of divine creation, a cosmic drama unfolded that would forever alter the course of human history. This is the story of an unholy union between the heavenly and earthly realms, a transgression so profound that its consequences would echo through millennia, shaping not only the destiny of mankind, but the very fabric of reality itself. The narrative begins in the book of Genesis, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, where we encounter one of the most enigmatic passages in all of sacred literature. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." These few verses contain within them a mystery that has puzzled theologians, scholars, and researchers for over 2,000 years. Who were these sons of God? What was the nature of their union with human women? And most intriguingly, who were the Nephilim that resulted from this cosmic transgression? To understand the magnitude of this event, we must first examine the Hebrew terminology used in the original text. The phrase, sons of God, is translated from the Hebrew B'nai Elohim, a term that appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible specifically in reference to angels or divine beings. In the book of Job, for instance, we read of the B'nai Elohim presenting themselves before the Lord, clearly indicating celestial beings rather than human descendants. The word Nephilim itself comes from the Hebrew root naphal, meaning to fall. This etymology has led many scholars to interpret the Nephilim as the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. The implications of this interpretation are staggering, suggesting that these beings were not merely physically imposing, but were instruments of spiritual and moral corruption. Dr. Michael Heiser, a renowned biblical scholar and expert in ancient Near Eastern languages, has extensively researched this topic. His analysis of the Hebrew text reveals that the traditional interpretation of the sons of God as the lineage of Seth, the righteous son of Adam, faces significant linguistic challenges. The consistent use of B'nai Elohim throughout the Hebrew Bible to denote divine beings strongly suggests that Genesis 6 describes a supernatural event, not merely the intermarriage between two human lineages. The ancient Jewish interpretative tradition, as preserved in texts like 1 Enoch and Jubilees, unanimously understood this passage as describing the fall of angels who abandoned their heavenly stations to mate with human women. The book of 1 Enoch, though not included in the biblical canon, was widely regarded as authoritative in the Second Temple period and provides extensive detail about this cosmic rebellion. According to 1 Enoch, 200 angels, led by their chief Semjaza, descended to Mount Hermon and took an oath to carry out their plan despite knowing the consequences. These angels, known as the Watchers, had been assigned to observe and guide humanity. Instead, they became enamored with human women and chose to rebel against the divine order. The text describes how these fallen angels not only produced giant offspring, but also corrupted humanity by teaching forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught men to make weapons of war, while others revealed the secrets of cosmetics, jewelry, astrology, and sorcery. This transfer of heavenly knowledge to an unprepared humanity resulted in unprecedented violence, corruption, and spiritual degradation. Archaeological evidence from various ancient civilizations seems to support the existence of a global tradition remembering giants or divine human hybrids. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh speaks of the Anunnaki, divine beings who came to Earth. Greek mythology tells of the Titans and the offspring of gods and mortals. Norse legends describe the Jotuns or frost giants. Hindu texts mention the Daityas and Danavas, races of giants born from unions between divine beings and humans. This universality of giant traditions across disparate cultures that had no contact with each other suggests a common historical memory of actual events rather than mere mythological coincidence. The consistency of these accounts across time and geography is remarkable, particularly considering the specific details they share: divine beings mating with humans, the birth of giant offspring, the corruption of humanity, and divine judgment that follows. The physical characteristics attributed to the Nephilim in ancient texts are nothing short of extraordinary. The Book of Numbers describes the Israelite spies' encounter with the descendants of Enoch, whom they identified as Nephilim. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. This comparison suggests beings of truly colossal proportions, perhaps 15 to 20 feet in height or even larger. 1 Enoch provides even more specific details, describing giants who were 3,000 cubits tall, approximately 4,500 feet. While this may seem fantastical, it's important to remember that these texts were describing beings that were the product of supernatural unions, not bound by natural biological limitations. The hybridization of divine and human genetics would presumably result in creatures that transcended normal physical constraints. The influence of these beings extended far beyond their imposing physical presence. According to ancient sources, they possessed supernatural strength, longevity, and intellectual capabilities that far exceeded those of ordinary humans. They became the rulers and heroes of the ancient world, establishing themselves as gods in the eyes of humanity and founding the mythological pantheons that would dominate ancient religion. This interpretation helps explain the origin of polytheistic religions worldwide. Rather than being mere human imagination, the gods of ancient mythologies may have been historical memories of the Nephilim and their angelic fathers. The Greek Olympians, the Egyptian pantheon, the Norse Aesir, and countless other divine hierarchies could represent distorted recollections of these antediluvian giants and their supernatural progenitors. The moral implications of the Nephilim's existence were catastrophic. Genesis 6:5 tells us that the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. This complete corruption of humanity directly followed the account of the Nephilim, suggesting a causal relationship between their presence and the moral degradation that necessitated the Great Flood. The corruption wasn't merely moral, but extended to the genetic level. According to the Book of Jasher and other ancient texts, the mixing of angelic and human genetics resulted in creatures that were abominations in the sight of God. Some sources suggest that this genetic corruption extended beyond humans to animals, creating chimeric creatures that violated the divine order of creation. This understanding provides crucial context for God's command to Noah to preserve clean animals by pairs and unclean animals by sevens. The distinction may not have been merely ceremonial, but could have related to genetic purity, with Noah tasked with preserving uncorrupted representatives of each species while allowing the extinction of hybrid abominations. The flood narrative takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. Rather than being an arbitrary act of divine wrath, the deluge becomes a necessary surgical procedure to remove a cosmic cancer that threatened to completely corrupt God's creation. The preservation of Noah and his family wasn't just about saving righteous individuals, but about maintaining pure human genetics for the continuation of God's plan for humanity. However, the story doesn't end with the flood. Genesis 6:4 contains a troubling phrase: "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." This suggests that somehow the giant bloodline survived the deluge. Various theories have been proposed to explain this apparent contradiction. Some scholars suggest that the corruption re-entered the human gene pool through Noah's daughter-in-law, possibly explaining the presence of giants among Noah's descendants. Others propose that the fallen angels renewed their transgression after the flood, creating a second incursion of Nephilim. Still others point to the possibility that some giants survived the flood in underground refuges or remote locations. The implications of post-flood Nephilim become clear when we examine the conquest narratives in the books of Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. The Israelites' encounters with giants weren't chance meetings with anomalously large humans, but confrontations with the surviving remnants of the pre-flood corruption. God's commands to completely destroy these peoples, including women and children, take on new meaning when understood as divine surgery to remove ongoing genetic contamination. The famous account of David and Goliath represents more than a story of courage overcoming overwhelming odds. Goliath was identified as coming from Gath, one of the cities of the Anakim, the known descendants of the Nephilim. David's victory wasn't just military but spiritual, representing God's ongoing war against the giants and their corrupting influence. Archaeological discoveries have provided tantalizing hints that support the existence of ancient giants. Enormous skeletal remains have been reported from various sites worldwide, though many of these finds have mysteriously disappeared or been discredited by mainstream archaeology. The reluctance of academic institutions to seriously investigate such discoveries has led to charges of deliberate suppression, with some researchers suggesting that evidence of giants threatens established evolutionary paradigms. The city of Baalbek in Lebanon provides particularly intriguing evidence. The ancient temple complex contains stone blocks weighing over 800 tons, moved and precisely placed with a level of engineering that challenges our understanding of ancient capabilities. Traditional archaeology attributes these megalithic structures to Roman engineering, but the precision and scale suggest technologies or capabilities beyond what we typically associate with ancient civilizations. Similar megalithic structures worldwide, from Stonehenge to Sacsayhuaman, from the Easter Island statues to the massive stones of Puma Punku, all share characteristics that suggest construction by beings with capabilities far exceeding normal human limitations. The precision of cutting, the massive weights involved, and the sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics embodied in these structures point to builders with superhuman abilities. The genetic implications of the Nephilim account have gained new relevance in our modern age of genetic engineering and human enhancement. The ancient prohibition against mixing divine and human genetics takes on contemporary significance as scientists develop technologies that could theoretically recreate similar genetic hybridization. Some researchers have suggested that the modern UFO phenomenon might represent a continuation of the ancient Watcher activities, with alleged alien abductions and genetic experiments mirroring the angelic transgressions described in ancient texts. While this interpretation remains highly speculative, it demonstrates the enduring relevance of the Nephilim narrative to contemporary concerns about human genetic integrity and the boundaries of technological advancement. The theological implications extend beyond historical curiosity to fundamental questions about the nature of humanity and our relationship with the divine. If the Nephilim account is understood literally, it suggests that the spiritual realm can and does interact with the physical world in dramatic and consequential ways. This challenges naturalistic worldviews that confine reality to purely material processes. Furthermore, the Nephilim narrative provides crucial context for understanding prophecies about the end times. Jesus' words in Matthew 24:37, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man," take on new significance when understood as referring not just to moral corruption, but to a potential repeat of the supernatural events that characterized the antediluvian world. The Book of Revelation's references to demonic beings emerging from the abyss and Daniel's prophecy about iron mixed with clay in the latter days have been interpreted by some scholars as pointing to a future repetition of the Nephilim phenomenon. This interpretation suggests that the end times will witness another eruption of supernatural beings into human affairs, culminating in a final confrontation between the forces of heaven and earth. As we conclude this first chapter of our exploration into the Nephilim, we find ourselves confronting questions that challenge our most basic assumptions about history, religion, and the nature of reality itself. The account of the sons of God and the daughters of men isn't merely an ancient curiosity, but a key that unlocks understanding of humanity's true history and ultimate destiny. The implications ripple forward through time, influencing everything from the development of ancient civilizations to modern genetic research, from archaeological mysteries to eschatological prophecies. The Nephilim stand at the crossroads of the natural and supernatural, the human and divine, the ancient and the contemporary. In our next chapter, we will delve deeper into the ancient texts that preserve detailed accounts of these beings, particularly the Book of Enoch, and its vivid descriptions of the Watcher's rebellion and its catastrophic consequences for both heaven and earth. The story we have begun here is far from over. Indeed, according to many ancient and modern interpreters, it may be building toward a climactic conclusion that will determine the fate of humanity itself. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and from their union came beings that defied the very foundations of created order. The Nephilim were more than giants. They were harbingers of a cosmic conflict that continues to this day, a conflict in which every human being has a stake and in which the ultimate questions of existence find their most dramatic expression. To truly understand the magnitude of the Nephilim phenomenon, we must turn to one of the most extraordinary and controversial texts of antiquity, the Book of Enoch. This ancient work, attributed to Enoch, the seventh from Adam, who walked with God, and was taken up to heaven without experiencing death, provides the most detailed account of the angelic rebellion that produced the giants. Though excluded from the biblical canon by later church councils, the Book of Enoch was revered by Jews and early Christians alike, quoted by the Apostle Jude, and considered authoritative by many church fathers. The Book of Enoch, also known as 1 Enoch to distinguish it from later Enochic literature, was likely compiled between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, though it claims to record events from the primordial past. The text survived primarily in Ethiopian manuscripts, though fragments in Aramaic were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirming its ancient origins and widespread circulation in Second Temple Judaism. What makes the Book of Enoch particularly valuable for understanding the Nephilim is its claim to be an eyewitness account. According to the text, Enoch was taken up into the heavenly realms, where he witnessed the rebellion of the Watchers firsthand, and was commissioned by God to pronounce judgment upon the fallen angels. This gives the work an immediacy and authority that resonates powerfully with readers seeking to understand these mysterious events. The rebellion begins with a group of 200 angels, known as the Watchers, or Grigori in some traditions. These beings were originally appointed by God to observe and guide humanity, stationed in the heavenly realm with specific instructions not to interfere directly in human affairs. They were, according to Enoch, holy watchers, whose duty was to remain pure and separate from the corruption of the earthly realm. The leader of this rebellion was Semjaza, also called Shemihaza, whose name means "my name has seen," or "the name sees." Under his leadership, the 200 Watchers descended to Mount Hermon, which sits on the border between modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. The choice of this location was not arbitrary. Mount Hermon's name derives from the Hebrew word herem, meaning banned or cursed, and the mountain was considered a gateway between the earthly and heavenly realms in ancient Near Eastern cosmology. Before descending, the Watchers took a binding oath, knowing full well the consequences of their intended actions. Enoch records their words, "Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children." But this was no casual decision. The text makes clear that these angels understood they were violating divine law and entering into rebellion against the Most High. Their oath was both a pact of solidarity and a recognition that there would be no return from their chosen path. The names of the chief watchers are preserved in Enoch's account, each carrying significance that reveals their particular areas of corruption and influence. Semjaza led the rebellion itself. Azazel, whose name means God strengthens, or scapegoat of God, became the primary teacher of forbidden knowledge. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakil taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the courses of the moon. Each of these names represents not just an individual fallen angel, but a category of forbidden knowledge that was transmitted to humanity. The systematic nature of this knowledge transfer suggests that the corruption of humanity was not accidental, but deliberate and comprehensive, designed to fundamentally alter human civilization and consciousness. The physical union between the Watchers and human women produced offspring that were giants in every sense of the word. Enoch describes these creatures as being 300 cubits tall, approximately 450 feet, though some manuscripts suggest even greater heights. While these numbers may seem fantastical, we must remember that these beings were the products of supernatural genetics, not bound by natural biological limitations. The giants, called Nephilim in Hebrew tradition and various names in other cultures, possessed not only enormous physical stature, but supernatural abilities inherited from their angelic fathers. They were described as having immense strength, the ability to communicate with spiritual beings, extended lifespans, and knowledge of secrets normally hidden from humanity. They became the heroes and demigods of ancient mythology, establishing themselves as rulers over human populations. However, the corruption introduced by the Watchers extended far beyond the physical realm. Azazel, in particular, is singled out in Enochic literature as the primary source of humanity's corruption. He taught men the art of making swords, knives, shields, and armor, introducing warfare on a scale previously unknown. He also taught women the arts of cosmetics and jewelry, which Enoch presents not as mere vanity but as forms of deception and spiritual corruption. The knowledge transmitted by the fallen Watchers included metallurgy, astronomy, divination, sorcery, and various forms of magic. While some of these might seem beneficial, the text presents them as premature revelations that humanity was not spiritually mature enough to handle. The result was not enlightenment but corruption, as humans used this knowledge for violence, exploitation, and spiritual rebellion against God. The giants themselves became consumers of human resources on an unprecedented scale. Enoch describes how they devoured all the acquisitions of men, consuming entire harvests and livestock until humans could no longer sustain them. When the food ran out, the giants turned to cannibalism, first consuming humans and then each other. The earth, according to Enoch, cried out against these abominations, and their violence filled the world. The ecological and social disruption caused by the giants and their fathers was comprehensive. Normal human society became impossible as these supernatural beings dominated every aspect of life. They established mystery schools and religious systems that diverted worship from the Creator to themselves and their offspring. They corrupted human genetics not only through direct reproduction, but by teaching humans to engage in practices that violated natural order. The Book of Jubilees, another pseudepigraphic text that parallels many themes in Enoch, suggests that the corruption extended to the animal kingdom as well. According to Jubilees, the Watchers taught humans to mate with animals, creating chimeric creatures that violated the boundaries of species. This genetic chaos threatened to corrupt all of creation, not just humanity. The response from heaven was swift and decisive. According to Enoch, God sent the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel to deal with the crisis. Each was given specific tasks in the divine judgment. Gabriel was sent to destroy the giants by causing them to war against each other. Michael was commissioned to bind Semjaza and his associates until the day of judgment. Raphael was tasked with binding Azazel and casting him into darkness. Uriel was sent to warn Noah of the coming flood. The binding of Azazel is described in particularly vivid detail. The archangel Raphael was commanded to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. Make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudale, and cast him there. Place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light. This binding was not merely punitive, but protective, preventing Azazel from continuing his corruption of humanity. The text suggests that Azazel's influence was so pervasive that only complete isolation could stop the spread of his corruption. The location of Dudale, somewhere in the wilderness, became a place of desolation associated with the scapegoat ritual described in Leviticus 16. The fate of the other Watchers was similarly severe. They were bound in chains of darkness, imprisoned in valleys of the earth until the day of final judgment. Unlike Azazel, who was immediately consigned to his prison, the other Watchers were forced to watch as their giant offspring destroyed each other in fratricidal warfare, fulfilling the divine judgment that their own rebellion would ultimately consume itself. The giants' destruction came through both divine intervention and their own violent nature. Enoch describes how God caused them to turn against each other, their supernatural strength becoming the instrument of their mutual annihilation. This internal warfare was so devastating that it eliminated most of the giant population even before the flood, though some survived to face the ultimate judgment of the deluge. The psychological torment of the bound watchers was as significant as their physical imprisonment. They were forced to witness the consequences of their rebellion not only in the destruction of their offspring, but in the ongoing corruption of humanity. They could see the chain of cause and effect that led from their initial transgression to the complete moral collapse that necessitated the flood. Enoch's role in these events was not merely that of a passive observer. According to the text, he was appointed as an intercessor between the fallen watchers and God. The bound angels pleaded with Enoch to petition God for mercy on their behalf, hoping that their punishment might be reduced or their eventual restoration made possible. However, when Enoch presented their petition to the throne of God, the response was unequivocal. "Go and tell the watchers of heaven who have sent you to intercede for them, you should intercede for men and not men for you. Why have you left the high, holy, and eternal heaven and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your sons? And though you were holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh, and as the children of men have lusted after flesh and blood, as those also do who die and perish." This divine response reveals several crucial theological principles. First, the angels' fall was irreversible because they had perfect knowledge of God's law when they chose to rebel. Unlike humans, who can plead ignorance or weakness, the Watchers' transgression was committed with full understanding of its consequences. Second, their corruption was not merely external but internal. They had fundamentally altered their own nature through their actions. The text also reveals that the Watchers had forfeited their immortality through their rebellion. The phrase, "living the eternal life," in the past tense suggests that their disobedience had cost them their eternal existence. They had become subject to judgment and ultimate destruction, having chosen mortality through their lust for mortal women. The Book of Enoch provides additional details about the ongoing influence of the Watchers even after their binding. According to the text, the spirits of the dead giants became demons that continue to plague humanity. Unlike the souls of humans, which depart to their appointed destinations after death, the spirits of the Nephilim were condemned to wander the earth, causing mischief and corruption until the final judgment. This teaching provides an etiology for the demons frequently mentioned in Jewish and Christian literature. Rather than being abstract forces of evil, demons are presented as the disembodied spirits of the antediluvian giants, retaining some of their supernatural knowledge and power, but lacking physical bodies to fully manifest their destructive potential. The influence of these demonic spirits explains the persistence of forbidden knowledge and corrupt practices throughout human history. Even after the flood eliminated the physical giants and bound their angelic fathers, the spiritual contamination continued through these wandering spirits. They became the familiar spirits of mediums, the gods of pagan religions, and the tempters who lead humans into various forms of corruption. Enoch's visions also included prophecies about the ultimate fate of the Watchers and their offspring. He was shown the final judgment when all the bound angels would be released from their prisons, only to face eternal destruction. The day of judgment would see not only the punishment of the wicked, but the vindication of the righteous, and the restoration of creation to its original purity. The eschatological sections of Enoch describe a cosmic renewal in which the corruption introduced by the Watchers would be completely eliminated. A new heaven and earth would be established, populated by the righteous who had remained faithful despite the corruption surrounding them. This vision provided hope to those living in times of oppression and spiritual darkness, assuring that divine justice would ultimately prevail. The Book of Enoch's influence on later Jewish and Christian thought cannot be overstated. Its themes appear throughout the New Testament, particularly in the writings of Peter and Jude. The Epistle of Jude directly quotes from Enoch's prophecy about the coming judgment, treating the book as authoritative scripture. Peter's references to angels who sinned and were cast into hell clearly draw from Enochic traditions. Early Christian writers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian all accepted the Enochic account of the Watchers' rebellion as historical fact. They saw in this narrative an explanation for the origin of demons, the corruption of humanity, and the necessity of divine judgment. The influence of Enochic thought can be traced through centuries of Christian theology and demonology. However, as Christianity became more institutionalized and influenced by Greek philosophical thought, the literal interpretation of Enoch began to fall out of favor. By the time of Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries, the sons of God in Genesis 6 were being reinterpreted as the lineage of Seth rather than fallen angels. This shift reflected a desire to present Christianity as more philosophically sophisticated to the Greco-Roman world. The relegation of Enoch to apocryphal status by church councils was motivated partly by theological concerns about its implications for angelology, and partly by cultural factors as Christianity sought acceptance in the Roman Empire. However, the book never completely disappeared, surviving in Ethiopian Christianity and in fragmentary form in other traditions. Modern archaeological discoveries have renewed interest in Enochic literature. The finding of Aramaic fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls proved that the book was widely circulated in Second Temple Judaism and was considered authoritative by many Jews of Jesus' time. This has led to a reassessment of its value for understanding the religious and intellectual context of early Christianity. The Book of Enoch's detailed account of the Watchers' rebellion provides crucial context for understanding the Nephilim phenomenon. Rather than being merely large humans or the products of human intermarriage, the giants emerge from this text as the monstrous offspring of a supernatural rebellion that threatened to corrupt all of creation. Their existence represented not just a physical anomaly, but a cosmic crisis that required divine intervention on the scale of the Great Flood. As we move forward in our exploration of the Nephilim, the Book of Enoch serves as our primary window into the antediluvian world. Its vivid descriptions of angelic rebellion, giant warfare, and divine judgment provide the narrative framework within which all other evidence must be understood. The text presents us with a cosmos in which the boundaries between heaven and earth are permeable, where supernatural beings can and do intervene in human affairs with consequences that echo through history. The rebellion of the Watchers was more than a historical event. It was the opening chapter in a cosmic conflict that continues to this day. Understanding this ancient rebellion and its consequences is essential for comprehending not only the past, but the present and future of humanity's relationship with the divine realm. The antediluvian world had become a realm of unimaginable corruption. What began as a transgression by 200 fallen angels had cascaded into a global catastrophe that threatened the very foundations of creation. The earth, according to ancient texts, had become filled with violence, genetic abomination, and spiritual darkness that penetrated every aspect of existence. The time had come for divine intervention on a scale that would reshape the planet itself. The Hebrew word used in Genesis to describe the state of the world before the flood is kamas, which signifies not merely violence, but a specific type of corruption that involves the perversion of natural order and divine law. This wasn't random brutality, but systematic corruption that had infected the very DNA of creation. The Nephilim and their angelic fathers had not simply introduced new forms of wickedness, they had fundamentally altered the nature of existence on earth. According to the Book of Jasher, an ancient Hebrew text that provides additional details about the antediluvian period, the corruption extended far beyond human society. The fallen angels and their giant offspring had corrupted not only humanity, but all living creatures. Animals were crossbred in unnatural ways, creating chimeric abominations that violated the divine order established at creation. The text describes creatures that were part human, part animal, and part something else entirely, monstrous hybrids that served as both slaves and soldiers for the Nephilim overlords. The technological advancement of the pre-flood world was unprecedented, but it was technology put to corrupt purposes. The knowledge transmitted by the Watchers had enabled the development of weapons of mass destruction, sophisticated methods of genetic manipulation, and technologies that seemed almost magical to later generations. Ancient texts speak of flying machines, advanced metallurgy, and architectural achievements that would not be seen again until modern times. Yet this technological prowess was coupled with moral degradation that made their advanced capabilities instruments of oppression and destruction. The giants used their superhuman strength and technological advantages to dominate human populations, establishing themselves as god-kings who demanded worship and tribute. They created a system of tyranny that made normal human life virtually impossible. The ecological impact of the Nephilim presence was devastating. These beings, some reaching heights of hundreds of feet according to ancient sources, required enormous amounts of food and resources to sustain themselves. The Book of Enoch describes how they consumed all the acquisitions of men, devouring entire harvests and herds until humans could no longer feed them. When conventional food sources were exhausted, the giants turned to cannibalism, first consuming humans and then each other in an orgy of violence that stained the earth with blood. The spiritual corruption was even more profound than the physical devastation. The Nephilim served as intermediaries between their angelic fathers and human populations, establishing mystery religions and occult practices that diverted worship from the Creator to created beings. They taught humanity to worship the host of heaven, to practice divination and sorcery, and to engage in rituals that opened doorways to demonic influence. Archaeological evidence suggests that megalithic structures worldwide may be remnants of this antediluvian civilization. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, with its massive carved stones and sophisticated astronomical alignments, date to periods that mainstream archaeology considers the dawn of civilization. Yet the precision and scale of these constructions suggest builders with capabilities far exceeding what we typically attribute to early human societies. The precision-cut stones at Pumapunku in Bolivia, some weighing over 100 tons and fitted together with tolerances measured in millimeters, demonstrate engineering capabilities that challenge our understanding of ancient technology. The massive stones of Baalbek in Lebanon, including the famous trilithon blocks weighing over 800 tons each, were quarried, transported, and precisely positioned using methods that remain mysterious to modern engineers. These megalithic sites share common characteristics that suggest a worldwide civilization with advanced technological capabilities. They demonstrate sophisticated understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering that seems incongruous with the traditional timeline of human development. The presence of similar architectural techniques and astronomical alignments across continents that were supposedly isolated from each other points to a unified global culture that possessed knowledge later lost to humanity. The genetic corruption introduced by the Nephilim was perhaps the most serious threat to God's creation. The mixing of angelic and human DNA had produced beings that were neither fully human nor fully divine, creatures that existed outside the natural order established by God. This genetic pollution threatened to spread throughout the human population, potentially corrupting all of humanity beyond the possibility of redemption. Ancient texts suggest that this corruption was deliberate, part of a cosmic strategy to prevent the birth of the promised Messiah by corrupting the human bloodline through which he would come. If all humanity became genetically corrupted, the prophecy of Genesis 3 verse 15 about the seed of the woman crushing the serpent's head could not be fulfilled. The salvation of humanity hung in the balance as the corruption spread throughout the antediluvian world. The Book of Jubilees provides additional insight into the extent of this corruption, describing how the Watchers taught humans to mate with animals, creating hybrid creatures that violated the boundaries between species. This genetic chaos threatened to corrupt all living things, not just humanity. The natural order established at creation was being systematically destroyed by beings who possessed the knowledge, but not the wisdom to use it responsibly. God's response to this cosmic crisis was both merciful and severe. Rather than destroying creation entirely, he chose to preserve a remnant through Noah and his family, while cleansing the earth of its corruption through the flood. This divine judgment was not arbitrary but surgical, designed to remove the cancer of corruption while preserving the healthy tissue of uncorrupted creation. The selection of Noah was not random, but based on his genetic purity. Genesis 6 verse 9 describes Noah as perfect in his generations, a phrase that in Hebrew carries implications of genetic integrity rather than merely moral righteousness. Noah and his family represented the uncorrupted human bloodline, the final hope for preserving pure humanity for future generations. The instructions given to Noah regarding the preservation of animals also take on new significance when viewed through this lens. The distinction between clean and unclean animals may have related not just to ceremonial law, but to genetic purity. Noah was tasked with preserving uncorrupted representatives of each species, while allowing the extinction of hybrid abominations that had no place in God's restored creation. The flood itself was a cataclysm of unprecedented proportions, designed not merely to drown the corrupt inhabitants of Earth, but to completely reshape the planet's surface. Geological evidence suggests that the pre-flood world had a very different climate and geography, possibly with a vapor canopy that provided uniform temperatures and protection from cosmic radiation. The breaking up of the fountains of the great deep and the opening of the windows of heaven describes a catastrophe that involved both underground water sources and atmospheric collapse. The violence of this global deluge explains many of the geological features we observe today. The rapid formation of sedimentary layers, the creation of massive fossil graveyards, and the carving of spectacular landscapes like the Grand Canyon all point to catastrophic water action on a scale never witnessed by modern humanity. The flood was not merely a local inundation, but a complete remaking of the Earth's surface. The destruction of the antediluvian world was so complete that virtually no trace of its advanced civilization survived. The megalithic structures that remain may be post-flood constructions, built by survivors who retained some knowledge of pre-flood technologies, or they may be the most durable remnants of a civilization that was otherwise swept away entirely. The binding of the Watchers during this period served multiple purposes. Not only were they prevented from continuing their corruption of humanity, but their imprisonment served as a warning to other spiritual beings about the consequences of rebellion against divine order. The Book of Enoch describes how all the angels in heaven witnessed the judgment of the Watchers, learning that even beings of their exalted status were not immune to divine justice. The psychological impact of the flood on the surviving human population cannot be overstated. Noah's family emerged into a world that had been completely transformed, devoid of the familiar landmarks and populated with the knowledge that divine judgment could and would fall upon widespread corruption. This traumatic memory was preserved in the flood legends found in virtually every human culture, testament to the reality of this global catastrophe. However, the story of the flood contains a troubling element that would have profound implications for post-Diluvian history. Genesis 6:4 states that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, suggesting that somehow the giant bloodline survived the deluge. This apparent contradiction has generated numerous theories about how genetic corruption might have entered the post-flood world. Some scholars propose that one of Noah's daughters-in-law carried corrupted genetics, possibly explaining references to giants among Noah's descendants. Others suggest that surviving Nephilim in underground refuges or remote locations managed to weather the flood. Still others point to the possibility of a second incursion of fallen angels after the deluge, renewing the corruption that the flood was meant to eliminate. The presence of post-flood giants becomes evident in the biblical narrative shortly after the Tower of Babel incident. The descendants of Ham, particularly through his son Canaan, seem to have been especially affected by the return of the giant bloodline. The Canaanite peoples encountered by the Israelites included numerous giant clans, suggesting that the corruption had re-established itself in specific geographical regions. This persistence of the Nephilim bloodline explains many of the puzzling aspects of the conquest narratives in the Hebrew Bible. God's commands to completely destroy certain peoples, including women and children, were not acts of arbitrary cruelty, but surgical strikes against renewed genetic corruption. The Israelites were serving as instruments of divine judgment, continuing the work of cleansing creation that had begun with the flood. The flood narrative also contains prophetic elements that point forward to future divine judgment. Jesus himself compared the conditions at his second coming to the days of Noah, suggesting that similar corruption and divine judgment would characterize the end times. This parallel implies that the spiritual and possibly physical conditions that necessitated the flood were requiring similar divine intervention. The theological implications of the flood account are profound. It demonstrates that God will not allow creation to be permanently corrupted, that divine justice will ultimately prevail over cosmic rebellion, and that moral and genetic purity are essential for humanity's relationship with its Creator. The flood serves as both historical fact and prophetic warning, reminding us that divine patience has limits and that corruption beyond a certain threshold will trigger decisive judgment. As we conclude this examination of the antediluvian corruption and the flood judgment, we see how the Nephilim phenomenon represents far more than ancient mythology. It reveals the cosmic dimensions of the spiritual war between good and evil, the fragility of creation when faced with supernatural corruption, and the lengths to which divine love will go to preserve the possibility of redemption for humanity. The flood waters receded, the earth was cleansed, and humanity was given a fresh start. Yet the shadow of the Nephilim would return, setting the stage for new conflicts between the children of men and the remnants of the giants who somehow survived the deluge. The story continues in the post-flood world, where the descendants of Noah would once again encounter the offspring of fallen angels, this time in the Promised Land itself. One of the most perplexing and controversial aspects of the Nephilim narrative lies in the troubling phrase found in Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. This simple statement creates a theological and historical puzzle that has challenged scholars for millennia. If the flood was intended to cleanse the earth of the corruption introduced by the Watchers and their giant offspring, how could these beings possibly survive the global deluge? The implications of post-flood giants extend far beyond academic curiosity, touching on fundamental questions about divine justice, the nature of corruption, and the ongoing spiritual warfare that would characterize human history. The appearance of giants in the post-flood world is not merely hinted at, but explicitly documented throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. When the Israelite spies returned from their reconnaissance of the Promised Land, they reported, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Numbers 13:33. This direct identification of post-flood giants as Nephilim creates an apparent contradiction that demands careful examination. The genealogical records in Genesis 10, known as the Table of Nations, provide crucial clues about how giant bloodlines might have survived the flood. The text specifically mentions that Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Genesis 10:8-9. The Hebrew word Gibborim, used to describe Nimrod, is the same term used for the mighty men who were the offspring of the Nephilim in Genesis 6:4. Nimrod's description as becoming mighty suggests a transformation rather than natural development. The phrase, mighty hunter before the Lord, has been interpreted by ancient Jewish commentators not as divine approval, but as rebellion against God, with Nimrod positioning himself as a rival to divine authority. The Targum of Onkelos translates this phrase as a mighty rebel before the Lord, indicating that Nimrod's might was used in opposition to God rather than in service to him. The location of Nimrod's kingdom provides additional significant information. Genesis 10:10 states that the first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. This region of Mesopotamia, known as Shinar, was not only the location of Nimrod's rebellion, but also the site where the Tower of Babel would later be constructed. The connection between post-flood giants and the Tower of Babel incident suggests that the corruption that had characterized the antediluvian world was reasserting itself in concentrated form. Archaeological evidence from ancient Mesopotamia reveals a pattern of megalithic construction and advanced civilization that seems to exceed what would be expected from early post-flood humanity. The massive ziggurats, sophisticated irrigation systems, and complex urban planning found in ancient Sumer and Babylon suggest the influence of beings with capabilities beyond normal human limitations. These accomplishments mirror the advanced civilization of the antediluvian world, implying continuity of knowledge and ability that survived the flood. The question of how giant bloodlines survived the global deluge has generated several theories among biblical scholars and ancient interpreters. The most straightforward explanation, though perhaps the most disturbing, is that the corruption re-entered the human gene pool through one of the women who entered the ark. Since Genesis provides detailed genealogies for the male line but says little about the wives of Noah's sons, it's possible that one of these women carried recessive genetic material that could produce giant offspring under certain conditions. Ancient Jewish traditions, preserved in works like the Book of Jasher and various rabbinic commentaries, suggest that Ham's wife may have been a descendant of Cain's line, which had been corrupted through contact with the Watchers and their offspring. According to these sources, Noah's son Ham discovered this corruption but chose to conceal it rather than expose it, leading to the eventual reappearance of giants among his descendants. This interpretation gains support from the biblical curse pronounced on Canaan, Ham's son, after Ham's inappropriate behavior regarding Noah's nakedness. The curse specifically targets Canaan rather than Ham himself, suggesting that there was something unique about Canaan's lineage that made him particularly susceptible to corruption. The subsequent identification of giant populations, primarily among the Canaanite peoples, supports this interpretation. The genealogical records in Genesis 10 reveal that giant populations emerged specifically from certain lineages, rather than being randomly distributed among all post-flood peoples. The descendants of Ham, particularly through the lines of Cush and Canaan, are consistently associated with giant populations in later biblical accounts. This pattern suggests genetic rather than environmental factors in the reappearance of giants. Cush, Ham's eldest son, was the father of Nimrod and is associated with the land of Ethiopia and southern Arabia in biblical geography. The Cushites are mentioned throughout Scripture as a people of unusual physical characteristics, often described as having dark skin and exceptional height. The identification of Nimrod as a mighty one from this lineage establishes a connection between the Cushite peoples and post-flood gigantism. The Canaanite connection to giants is even more explicitly documented. Genesis 10:15-18 lists the various Canaanite peoples, many of whom are later identified as giant populations in the conquest narratives. The Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, and other Canaanite groups all show evidence of unusual height and strength in biblical accounts of Israel's conflicts with them. An alternative theory for the survival of post-flood giants suggests that some of these beings may have survived the flood through supernatural means. If the original Nephilim possessed supernatural abilities inherited from their angelic fathers, it's conceivable that some could have survived the deluge through methods unavailable to normal humans. Ancient traditions speak of underground cities and hidden refuges where giants might have weathered the global catastrophe. Archaeological discoveries of vast underground complexes in various parts of the world have fueled speculation about antediluvian survival strategies. The underground city of Derinkuyu in Turkey, capable of housing thousands of people, represents just one example of ancient subterranean engineering that could theoretically have provided refuge during a global flood. While these complexes are typically dated to much later periods, some researchers suggest they might represent much older construction projects designed for catastrophic survival. A third possibility, considered by some ancient interpreters, is that the angelic transgression was renewed after the flood. According to this theory, other fallen angels, seeing the success of the original Watchers in corrupting humanity, chose to repeat the experiment in the post-flood world. This interpretation would explain not only the reappearance of giants, but also their concentration in specific geographical regions where new angelic rebellions might have occurred. The Book of Jubilees, which parallels many themes found in Enoch, suggests that demonic activity increased dramatically after the flood, as the spirits of the dead giants began their work of corrupting the new human population. According to Jubilees, these demonic entities were able to influence human genetics and behavior in ways that gradually reintroduced the corruptions that had characterized the antediluvian world. The geographical distribution of post-flood giants provides important clues about their origin and nature. Rather than appearing randomly throughout the world, giant populations are consistently associated with specific regions. The Middle East, particularly the land of Canaan, parts of North Africa, certain areas of Asia Minor, and isolated regions of Europe and Asia. This pattern suggests either genetic inheritance through specific bloodlines or concentrated supernatural activity in particular locations. The land of Canaan emerges as the primary focus of post-flood giant activity. When Abraham first entered the land, it was already inhabited by various peoples, many of whom are later identified as giants or as possessing unusual physical characteristics. The Anakim, Emim, Zamzumim, and Rephaim all inhabited different regions of what would become the Promised Land, creating a concentration of giant populations that seems unlikely to have occurred by chance. This concentration of giants in the Promised Land has led some interpreters to suggest that their presence was not coincidental but strategic. If Satan understood God's plan to give this land to Abraham's descendants, the establishment of giant populations there could represent a preemptive effort to prevent the fulfillment of divine promises. The contamination of the Promised Land with giant bloodlines would create both physical and spiritual obstacles to Israel's inheritance. The timing of giant appearances also provides significant information. The biblical record suggests that giant populations were most prominent during specific historical periods: the time of Abraham and the patriarchs, the period of the Exodus and conquest, and the era of the judges and early monarchy. During each of these periods, God's people faced existential threats from supernatural opponents that required divine intervention to overcome. The confrontation between David and Goliath represents perhaps the most famous encounter between an Israelite and a post-flood giant. Goliath's identification as coming from Gath, a Philistine city associated with the Anakim, establishes his connection to the ancient giant bloodlines. His height of 6 cubits and a span, approximately 9 feet 6 inches, places him within the range of other biblical giants, while falling short of the enormous dimensions attributed to the antediluvian Nephilim. Goliath's armor and weapons provide additional evidence of his supernatural nature. His bronze armor weighed 5,000 shekels, approximately 125 pounds, and his spear point alone weighed 600 shekels, about 15 pounds. These dimensions suggest not only unusual size, but supernatural strength necessary to wield such massive equipment effectively in battle. The description of his appearance, with its emphasis on his height, armor, and intimidating presence, mirrors ancient accounts of divine warriors from various mythological traditions. The Philistines' connection to giant bloodlines extends beyond Goliath to include other members of his family. 2 Samuel 21 verse 15 to 22 records David's encounters with 4 additional giants, all described as descendants of Rapha, a giant, in Gath. These included Ishbi-Benob, whose bronze spear weighed 300 shekels, Saph, or Sippai, and an unnamed giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. The genetic abnormality of polydactyly extra digits mentioned in this account has been noted in other ancient giant remains, suggesting a hereditary trait associated with the giant bloodlines. The strategic importance of eliminating giant populations becomes clear when viewed from the perspective of maintaining genetic and spiritual purity among God's chosen people. The consistent divine commands to completely destroy certain Canaanite populations, including women and children, has troubled many modern readers who view such commands as excessive or morally problematic. However, Understanding these populations as carrying corrupted genetics that could contaminate Israel's bloodline provides crucial context for these difficult passages. The Herem, devoted to destruction, commands given to Israel regarding certain Canaanite peoples were not arbitrary acts of divine cruelty, but surgical procedures designed to prevent the spread of genetic and spiritual corruption. Just as a surgeon must remove all cancerous tissue to prevent metastasis, God's commands to Israel required the complete elimination of corrupted bloodlines to preserve the integrity of the messianic lineage. The failure to completely eliminate these populations had consequences that extended throughout Israel's history. The intermarriage between Israelites and surviving Canaanite peoples introduced both genetic and spiritual corruption that plagued the nation for centuries. The recurring apostasy of Israel, their attraction to Canaanite religious practices, and the various physical and spiritual challenges they faced can be traced in part to their incomplete obedience to divine commands regarding the giant populations. The post-flood giants also appear to have retained some of the supernatural knowledge that characterized their antediluvian predecessors. Archaeological evidence from Canaanite sites reveals advanced metallurgy, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and religious practices that suggest contact with supernatural entities. The mystery religions associated with Canaanite culture, including child sacrifice and various forms of divination, mirror the corrupted practices that had characterized the pre-flood world. The construction capabilities attributed to some giant populations also suggest the retention of advanced technological knowledge. The massive stone structures found throughout the ancient Near East, from the trilithons of Baalbek to the cyclopean walls of various ancient cities, demonstrate engineering capabilities that challenge conventional understanding of ancient technology. These accomplishments may represent the continuation of antediluvian knowledge preserved through the giant bloodlines. The persistence of giant bloodlines into the monarchical period of Israel's history is documented in various biblical accounts. During the reigns of David and Solomon, encounters with giants continued to occur, suggesting that these populations had not been completely eliminated despite centuries of conflict. The ongoing presence of giants necessitated continued vigilance and military action to prevent their resurgence. The decline and eventual disappearance of giant populations from the historical record appears to have occurred gradually over several centuries. By the time of the later monarchy and the exile period, references to giants become increasingly rare, suggesting that the systematic efforts to eliminate these bloodlines had largely succeeded. However, some ancient sources suggest that remnant populations may have survived in remote locations or underground refuges. The genetic legacy of the post-flood giants may have extended beyond their obvious physical manifestations to include more subtle influences on human populations. Some researchers have suggested that certain hereditary traits associated with leadership, unusual intelligence, or physical capabilities might represent diluted expressions of ancient giant genetics. While such theories remain highly speculative, they raise intriguing questions about the long-term genetic impact of the Nephilim phenomenon. The eschatological implications of post-flood giants extend beyond their historical significance to prophecies about the end times. Jesus' reference to the days of Noah as a parallel to his second coming, Matthew 24:37, has been interpreted by some scholars as predicting a future return of Nephilim-like beings. This interpretation suggests that the giant phenomenon may not be merely historical but prophetic, with implications for understanding end-times events. The Book of Revelation's references to demonic beings emerging from the abyss and the appearance of supernatural armies in the end times have been connected by some interpreters to the Nephilim tradition. If the spirits of the dead giants have been bound in the abyss since the flood, their release during the tribulation period could represent a final resurgence of the corruption that characterized both the antediluvian and early post-flood worlds. Modern genetic research has raised new questions about the possibility of dormant genetic material that could theoretically be activated under certain conditions. The discovery of so-called junk DNA that may contain inactive genetic sequences has led to speculation about whether ancient genetic modifications could potentially be reactivated through advanced biotechnology. While such possibilities remain theoretical, they demonstrate the ongoing relevance of ancient genetic questions to contemporary scientific concerns. The survival and eventual elimination of post-flood giants represents a crucial chapter in the ongoing cosmic conflict between the forces of heaven and earth. Understanding how these beings survived the flood, established themselves in specific geographical regions, and gradually succumbed to divine judgment provides essential context for comprehending the spiritual warfare that characterizes human history. As we move forward in our examination of the Nephilim phenomenon, the post-flood giants serve as a bridge between the antediluvian world and the historical period documented in Scripture. Their presence confirms that the corruption introduced by the Watchers was not permanently eliminated by the flood, but continued to influence human civilization in more concentrated but still significant ways. The ultimate victory over these beings foreshadows the final triumph of divine justice over all forms of corruption and rebellion. The history of Israel is marked by a series of epic encounters with beings that defied all human logic, the descendants of the ancient Nephilim. These confrontations were not mere territorial or political conflicts, but cosmic battles that determined the fate of humanity and the fulfillment of divine promises. From the first explorations of the Promised Land to the days of King David, the chosen people repeatedly faced adversaries of supernatural stature, whose very existence represented both a physical and spiritual threat to God's redemptive plan. The first documented confrontation between Israel and the post-Diluvian giants occurred during the exploration of the Promised Land, an event that would profoundly mark the Israeli national psyche and reveal the true nature of the spiritual warfare that awaited them. When Moses sent 12 spies to reconnoiter the land that God had promised to Abraham's descendants, they returned with a report that would terrify an entire generation and delay the conquest for 40 years. Numbers 13, 32-33 records their chilling testimony. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This passage reveals several crucial elements about the nature of these giants. First, the spies explicitly identified them as Nephilim, directly connecting the post-flood giants to the antediluvian beings described in Genesis 6. This was not hyperbole or metaphor, but a specific identification based on their understanding of these creatures' supernatural origins. Second, the comparison to grasshoppers suggests beings of truly colossal proportions, perhaps 15 to 20 feet in height or even larger. The psychological impact of this encounter cannot be overstated. These were not ordinary men who shrank before the giants. The 12 spies were chosen leaders, representatives of each tribe, selected for their courage and capability. Yet even these exceptional individuals were reduced to feeling like insects in the presence of the Anakim. This terror was not merely physical, but spiritual, as they recognized they were facing beings that existed outside the natural order. The Hebrew term Anakim comes from the root word Anak, meaning long-necked or giant. These beings were concentrated in the hill country of Canaan, particularly around Hebron, where they had established strongholds that dominated the surrounding territories. Archaeological evidence from this region reveals massive fortifications and structures that suggest construction by beings with capabilities far exceeding normal human limitations. The genealogical records preserve the names of specific Anakim leaders encountered by the spies, Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, who were described as the sons of Anak. These were not merely large individuals, but representatives of established giant dynasties that had ruled over human populations for generations. Their names appear in ancient Near Eastern texts outside the Bible, confirming their historical reality and regional prominence. The giants did not live as nomadic wanderers, but had established sophisticated urban centers that served as bases for their dominion over human populations. These cities were characterized by massive fortifications that the Israelites described as having walls up to the sky, Deuteronomy 1:28. While this may seem like exaggeration, archaeological discoveries throughout the ancient Near East reveal construction techniques and stone sizes that challenge our understanding of ancient engineering capabilities. The city of Hebron, identified as a primary stronghold of the Anakim, was built with stones of enormous size, fitted together with precision that rivals modern construction techniques. Similar megalithic construction appears throughout the region that would become Israel, suggesting a unified building tradition that required capabilities beyond normal human strength and engineering knowledge. These fortified cities served multiple purposes in the giants' strategy of dominance. They provided defensive positions from which to control surrounding territories, served as centers for the collection of tribute from subjugated human populations, and functioned as religious centers where the giants promoted worship of themselves and their angelic progenitors. The archaeological record reveals evidence of cultic activities associated with these sites, including installations for ritual sacrifice and astronomical observations. The strategic placement of giant cities throughout Canaan was not coincidental, but represented a systematic occupation designed to prevent Israel from claiming their promised inheritance. Every major route into the land was dominated by giant strongholds, creating a network of supernatural opposition that would require divine intervention to overcome. When Israel finally entered the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership, they faced a military challenge unlike any in human history. They were not simply conquering territory from other human nations, but were engaged in cosmic warfare against beings whose supernatural origins gave them advantages that conventional military tactics could not overcome. The success of Israel's conquest required divine intervention at every stage, demonstrating that victory against the giants was impossible through human strength alone. The fall of Jericho provided the template for Israel's warfare against supernatural enemies. The city's massive walls, built to withstand any conventional siege, collapsed not through military engineering but through divine intervention, triggered by faithful obedience to God's specific instructions. This pattern would be repeated throughout the conquest, as Israel learned that victory against giant populations required spiritual rather than merely physical warfare. The destruction of Ai, despite its initial failure due to Achan's sin, further demonstrated the spiritual dimensions of warfare against giant descendants. The text reveals that Ai was inhabited by beings of unusual stature, and its conquest required not only military strategy but spiritual purification of Israel's camp. This connection between moral purity and military victory became a consistent theme in Israel's battles against giant populations. Joshua's systematic campaign against the Anakim is documented in Joshua 11:21-22. At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. This passage reveals several important aspects of the campaign against the giants. First, it was systematic and comprehensive, targeting not just individual giants, but entire populations and their urban centers. Second, it involved total destruction, Hiram in Hebrew, indicating divine commands for complete elimination rather than typical ancient warfare that often spared certain populations. Third, it acknowledges that some giants survived in Philistine territory, setting the stage for future conflicts. The survival of giants in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod was not due to military failure, but represented God's preservation of these populations for future testing of Israel's faithfulness. These surviving giants would later produce champions like Goliath, who would challenge Israel's trust in divine protection. The incomplete elimination of giant populations became a recurring theme that would trouble Israel throughout their history. The period of the Judges witnessed continued encounters between Israel and remnant giant populations, demonstrating that the conquest under Joshua had not completely eliminated the threat. These confrontations often occurred during times of spiritual decline, when Israel had abandoned their exclusive worship of Yahweh and become susceptible to the influence of the surviving giants and their supernatural knowledge. The account of the Nephilim's influence during this period is preserved in various ancient sources that describe how surviving giant populations established themselves as objects of worship among surrounding peoples. They promoted mystery religions and occult practices that echoed the antediluvian corruption, gradually influencing Israelite society through intermarriage and cultural exchange. Judges 1:20 records that Caleb successfully drove out the 3 sons of Enoch from Hebron, fulfilling his earlier promise to claim this giant stronghold. However, other passages reveal that many of the tribes failed to completely eliminate giant populations from their assigned territories, leading to ongoing problems with supernatural influence and periodic resurgences of giant activity. The failure to completely eliminate these populations had consequences that extended far beyond military concerns. The surviving giants served as conduits for the continuation of antediluvian knowledge and practices, gradually corrupting Israelite society through the introduction of forbidden technologies and spiritual practices. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the gradual adoption of Canaanite religious symbols and practices among Israelite communities, suggesting successful giant influence despite their reduced numbers. The most famous and detailed accounts of Israel's battles against giants occur during the reign of King David, representing the climactic phase of the conflict that had begun during the conquest period. These encounters were not random military conflicts, but represented a systematic divine strategy to eliminate the remaining giant bloodlines and complete the cleansing of the Promised Land. The confrontation between David and Goliath stands as the most iconic example of this supernatural warfare. Goliath's identification as coming from Gath, one of the cities where giants had survived Joshua's conquest, establishes his direct connection to the Anakim bloodlines. His dimensions, recorded as 6 cubits and a span, approximately 9 feet 6 inches, while impressive, were moderate compared to other giants mentioned in Scripture, suggesting that the surviving post-flood populations were somewhat diminished from their antediluvian predecessors. Goliath's armor and weapons provide crucial evidence of his supernatural nature and the advanced metallurgical knowledge preserved by giant populations. His bronze coat of mail weighed 5,000 shekels, approximately 125 pounds, while his spear point alone weighed 600 shekels, about 15 pounds. These dimensions indicate not only unusual size, but supernatural strength necessary to wield such massive equipment effectively in combat. The spiritual dimensions of David's victory become clear when examined in the context of cosmic warfare rather than merely human conflict. David's declaration that the battle is the Lord's and his use of simple shepherd's tools rather than conventional weapons demonstrated that victory against supernatural enemies required faith in divine power rather than reliance on human military technology. The aftermath of Goliath's defeat reveals the broader implications of this encounter. The Philistine army fled in terror, suggesting that Goliath's presence had been crucial to their military confidence. His death broke not only Philistine morale, but the spiritual intimidation that giant populations had exercised over human societies for generations. 2 Samuel 21:15-22 records David's encounters with 4 additional giants, all described as descendants of Rapha, a giant in Gath. These included Ishbi-Benob, whose bronze spear weighed 300 shekels and who nearly killed David in his old age; Saph, or Sippai, who was killed by Sibbecai the Hushathite; an unnamed giant killed by Elhanan; and another giant distinguished by having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, killed by Jonathan, David's nephew. The genetic abnormality of polydactyly extradigits, mentioned in the account of the last giant, has been noted in archaeological discoveries of unusually large skeletal remains from various ancient sites. This hereditary trait appears to have been associated with giant bloodlines, providing a genetic marker that confirms their supernatural origins and distinguishes them from merely tall humans. Israel's successful warfare against giant populations required the development of specialized tactics that acknowledged the supernatural nature of their enemies. Conventional military strategies that might succeed against human opponents proved inadequate when facing beings with superhuman strength, size, and potentially supernatural knowledge inherited from their angelic ancestors. The primary tactical principle was the recognition that victory depended on divine intervention rather than human military capability. This required maintaining spiritual purity within Israel's ranks, following specific divine instructions for each encounter, and approaching battles as acts of worship rather than merely military operations. The consistent success of this approach validated its theological foundations and provided a model for spiritual warfare that extended beyond the physical realm. Intelligence gathering took on unique dimensions when facing giant populations. Traditional scouting methods had to account for the psychological impact of encountering beings of supernatural stature, as demonstrated by the reaction of the 12 spies. Successful reconnaissance required individuals with exceptional faith and spiritual maturity who could assess giant capabilities without being overwhelmed by fear. Siege warfare against giant cities required divine intervention to overcome fortifications built with superhuman capabilities. The walls of these cities were not only massive, but constructed with precision that suggested knowledge of advanced engineering principles. Conventional siege engines and tactics proved inadequate against such defenses, necessitating supernatural intervention like the collapse of Jericho's walls. The cosmic rebellion that produced the Nephilim did not go unnoticed by the throne of the Almighty. What began as an act of angelic transgression cascaded into a universal crisis that demanded divine intervention of unprecedented magnitude. The judgment that fell upon the Watchers and their giant offspring represents one of the most severe punishments recorded in sacred literature, establishing eternal precedents for divine justice that continue to reverberate through the spiritual realm to this day. The severity of the Watchers' punishment reflects the magnitude of their transgression. These were not mere angels who had committed minor infractions, but high-ranking celestial beings who had deliberately abandoned their heavenly stations, violated the fundamental order of creation, and corrupted the very DNA of God's masterpiece, humanity itself. Their rebellion was not impulsive but calculated, not accidental but willful, and the consequences they faced were correspondingly absolute. According to the Book of Enoch, the divine response to the Watchers' then of rebellion was swift and multifaceted. God dispatched 4 of his most powerful archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, each with specific missions to address different aspects of the cosmic crisis. This heavenly intervention demonstrates that the corruption introduced by the Watchers was viewed not as a localized problem, but as a threat to the entire created order that required the attention of heaven's highest-ranking beings. The first aspect of divine judgment involved the immediate binding of the rebellious Watchers themselves. Unlike their giant offspring, who would face destruction in their physical forms, the fallen angels were subjected to imprisonment that would last until the final judgment. This binding was not merely physical but spiritual, preventing them from continuing their corruption while forcing them to witness the consequences of their actions. Raphael was specifically commissioned to deal with Azazel, the Watcher who had been primarily responsible for teaching forbidden knowledge to humanity. The archangel's instructions, as recorded in Enoch, were explicit and terrifying. Bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. Make an opening in the desert which is in Dudael, and cast him there. Place upon him rough and jagged rocks and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever and cover his face that he may not see light. The location of Azazel's imprisonment, Dudael, has been identified by various scholars as somewhere in the wilderness regions of the Middle East, possibly connected to the scapegoat ritual described in Leviticus 16. The symbolism is profound. The being who had taught humanity to create weapons and instruments of violence was himself bound with jagged rocks, experiencing the very brutality he had introduced to the world. His face was covered so that he could not see light, a particularly cruel punishment for a being who had once dwelt in the presence of divine glory. The binding described in these ancient texts goes beyond physical restraint to encompass complete isolation from the spiritual currents that sustain angelic existence. Cut off from the divine presence that had been their source of life and power, the bound Watchers experienced a form of spiritual death that was perhaps more torturous than physical destruction. They retained consciousness and memory, but lost the ability to act upon the world they had corrupted. Michael, the great warrior archangel, was tasked with binding Semjaza and his associates. The text describes how these angels were bound under the hills of the earth until the day of their final judgment. Unlike Azazel's solitary confinement, Semjaza and the other chief watchers were imprisoned together, forced to contemplate their rebellion in the company of their fellow conspirators. This group imprisonment served multiple purposes. It prevented any individual watcher from attempting escape, while ensuring that they would constantly remind each other of their fallen state. The psychological torment of the bound watchers was intensified by their forced observation of the destruction of their giant offspring. Gabriel's mission involved turning the Nephilim against each other in fratricidal warfare, and the imprisoned angels were compelled to watch as their children destroyed one another. For beings who had risked everything for the sake of their human consorts and giant progeny, witnessing this mutual annihilation represented the ultimate futility of their rebellion. The manner of the giants' destruction was itself a form of divine justice. Rather than being destroyed by external forces, they were turned against each other, their supernatural strength becoming the instrument of their mutual destruction. This internal warfare served as a demonstration that evil ultimately consumes itself, that rebellion against divine order carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Ancient texts describe the giant wars as conflicts of unimaginable violence and scale. These beings, some reaching heights of hundreds of feet according to Enochic literature, engaged in battles that shook the earth and filled the skies with their roars. Their weapons, forged according to the forbidden knowledge taught by their angelic fathers, were capable of destruction on a massive scale. The very landscape bore the scars of their conflicts, with entire regions being devastated by their supernatural warfare. The giants' cannibalistic turn, when they exhausted other food sources and began consuming humans and then each other, represented the complete moral bankruptcy of the corruption they embodied. These beings, who had started as the offspring of divine human unions, had devolved into monsters that consumed their own kind. This descent into absolute depravity justified the divine decision to eliminate them entirely from the earth. The binding of the Watchers was not intended to be temporary. Unlike human imprisonment, which serves rehabilitative or deterrent purposes, the confinement of the fallen angels was designed to be permanent until the final judgment. These beings had possessed perfect knowledge of divine law when they chose to rebel, making their transgression unforgivable in a way that human sin, committed in ignorance or weakness, was not. The New Testament provides additional insight into the nature and purpose of the Watchers' imprisonment. The Apostle Peter writes, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell and put them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment." 2 Peter 2:4. The Greek word translated as hell here is Tartarus, a term that in Greek mythology referred to the deepest, most terrible region of the underworld, reserved for the punishment of the most heinous criminals against the gods. Jude's epistle provides parallel testimony, and the angels who did not keep their positions of authority but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. Jude 1:6. The phrase everlasting chains emphasizes the permanent nature of their confinement, while the great day refers to the final judgment when their temporary imprisonment will give way to eternal punishment. The concept of everlasting chains deserves particular attention. These are not physical restraints, but spiritual bonds that prevent the fallen angels from exercising their supernatural abilities or influencing the physical world directly. However, the binding appears to allow them limited communication abilities, as evidenced by their successful petition to Enoch to intercede for them with God, and possibly by the continuation of demonic activity throughout human history. The theological implications of the Watchers' binding are profound. It demonstrates that divine justice operates according to perfect knowledge and absolute standards. The angels' punishment was not arbitrary but perfectly calibrated to their offense. They had used their freedom to corrupt creation, so their freedom was removed. They had abandoned their proper dwelling place to interfere in human affairs, so they were confined to a place of darkness. They had sought to elevate themselves above their appointed station, so they were cast down to the lowest depths. The binding also serves as a warning to other spiritual beings about the consequences of rebellion against divine order. The Book of Enoch describes how all the angels in heaven witnessed the judgment of the Watchers, learning that even beings of their exalted status were not immune to divine justice if they chose to rebel. This demonstration of divine power and justice served to prevent other potential rebellions among the heavenly host. The location of the Watchers' imprisonment has been a subject of considerable speculation and theological debate. Various ancient texts place their confinement in different locations, beneath mountains, in the depths of the earth, in valleys of darkness, or in a separate spiritual dimension altogether. The diversity of these accounts may reflect the fact that spiritual realities cannot be perfectly mapped onto physical geography, or it may indicate that different groups of fallen angels are confined in different locations. Some scholars have connected the Watchers' imprisonment to various geographical features mentioned in ancient texts. The valleys mentioned in Enoch may correspond to actual locations in the Middle East, where unusual geological formations or persistent spiritual darkness have been reported throughout history. Mount Hermon, where the Watchers first descended, continues to be associated with spiritual significance in various traditions, possibly reflecting its role as a gateway between the spiritual and physical realms. The duration of the Watchers' imprisonment extends from the time of their binding until the final judgment, a period that encompasses all of human history from the flood to the end times. This extended confinement serves multiple purposes beyond punishment. It provides humanity with a reprieve from direct angelic corruption, allows for the gradual purification of the earth from the consequences of their rebellion, and creates space for God's redemptive plan to unfold without supernatural interference. However, the binding of the Watchers did not eliminate all supernatural influence on human affairs. The spirits of their dead giant offspring, according to Enochic tradition, were not bound but left to wander the earth as demons. This partial judgment, binding the angelic fathers while allowing their spiritual descendants to remain active, created an ongoing spiritual conflict that would characterize the entire post-flood era. The demons, as disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, retained some of the supernatural knowledge and abilities of their giant ancestors, but lacked physical bodies to fully manifest their power. This limitation made them dependent on possession of humans or animals to achieve their destructive purposes, leading to the phenomenon of demonic possession documented throughout human history. Their activities represent a continuation of the corruption introduced by their angelic grandfathers, though in a more limited and manageable form. The binding of the Watchers also had implications for human spiritual development. With the direct source of forbidden knowledge removed, humanity was left to develop naturally within the bounds of divine revelation. This created space for genuine spiritual growth based on faith and obedience, rather than supernatural knowledge obtained through rebellion. The absence of direct angelic corruption allowed for the possibility of authentic human relationship with God. The effectiveness of the Watchers' binding is demonstrated by the absence of any comparable angelic rebellion in post-flood history. While demonic activity continued and even intensified in some periods, there are no recorded instances of angels abandoning their heavenly stations to mate with humans or directly establish themselves as rulers over human populations. The severe punishment of the original rebels served as a deterrent that prevented similar transgressions. The eschatological dimensions of the Watchers' punishment become evident in prophecies about the end times. The Book of Revelation speaks of Satan being bound for 1,000 years, paralleling the binding of the Watchers but with a predetermined term of confinement. This parallel suggests that the principles of divine justice demonstrated in the punishment of the Watchers will find their ultimate expression in the final judgment of all rebellious spiritual beings. The release of demons from the abyss, described in Revelation 9, may represent the reversal of the Watchers' binding allowing these ancient rebels to participate in the final rebellion against God. If this interpretation is correct, the end times will witness not only the release of Satan from his millennial binding, but also the liberation of the Watchers from their ancient prison, creating a convergence of spiritual forces that will precipitate the final conflict between heaven and earth. The ultimate fate of the Watchers extends beyond their current imprisonment to their final destruction. Unlike the possibility of redemption offered to humanity, the fallen angels face certain and eternal punishment. Their perfect knowledge at the time of their rebellion makes their transgression unforgivable, and their punishment correspondingly absolute. The eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels mentioned by Jesus represents their final destination. The theological significance of the Watcher's punishment extends to fundamental questions about the nature of justice, mercy, and redemption. Their irreversible condemnation demonstrates that divine mercy has limits, that there are transgressions beyond the reach of forgiveness, and that perfect knowledge carries perfect responsibility. These beings serve as cautionary examples of the ultimate consequences of deliberate rebellion against divine order. The contrast between the punishment of the Watchers and the possibility of human redemption highlights the unique position of humanity in the cosmic order. While the angels who sinned face irreversible judgment, humans who sin can find forgiveness through divine grace. This distinction reflects not arbitrary divine favoritism, but the different circumstances of angelic and human transgression. Angels sinned with perfect knowledge in the presence of divine glory, while humans sin in ignorance and weakness, separated from direct divine presence. Archaeological and geological evidence has been interpreted by some researchers as supporting the reality of the Watcher's binding. Certain locations mentioned in ancient texts as sites of their imprisonment show unusual characteristics: electromagnetic anomalies, persistent spiritual darkness, or geological features that suggest catastrophic events in the distant past. While such evidence remains speculative, it demonstrates the continuing relevance of these ancient accounts to contemporary investigation. The binding of the Watchers also provides a framework for understanding the limitations of demonic activity in the post-flood world. While evil spiritual forces remain active, their power is constrained by the absence of their angelic leaders. The demons that plague humanity are the disembodied spirits of dead giants, possessing supernatural knowledge but lacking the full power and authority of their angelic predecessors. This limitation explains why demonic activity, while real and destructive, operates within bounds that prevent it from completely overwhelming human resistance. The progressive revelation of the Watcher's fate throughout Scripture demonstrates the consistency of divine justice across time. From the initial judgment recorded in Enoch through the New Testament references to bound angels awaiting final judgment, the narrative maintains that divine justice, though sometimes delayed, is ultimately certain and complete. The Watcher's binding serves as both historical fact and prophetic promise that all rebellion against divine order will ultimately be judged and punished. Modern implications of the Watcher's punishment extend to contemporary questions about the boundaries of human knowledge and technological development. If the original corruption resulted from the premature revelation of heavenly secrets to unprepared humanity, current advances in genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and other potentially transformative technologies raise questions about whether humanity is once again approaching boundaries that should not be crossed without divine permission. The permanence of the Watcher's binding until the final judgment suggests that their release will coincide with the climax of human history. This timing is not coincidental, but purposeful, designed to concentrate all forces of rebellion, both human and spiritual, into a final confrontation that will settle the cosmic conflict once and for all. The ultimate victory of divine justice over all forms of rebellion is assured by the precedent established in the punishment of the Watchers. As we conclude this examination of the Watchers' eternal judgment, we see how their punishment serves multiple purposes: justice for their transgression, protection for humanity from further direct corruption, warning to other spiritual beings about the consequences of rebellion and demonstration of divine power and righteousness. Their binding represents not merely the punishment of individual rebels, but the maintenance of cosmic order itself. The chains that bind the Watchers in darkness are forged from divine justice itself, unbreakable until the appointed time when they will be released only to face final destruction. Their imprisonment spans the entirety of human history, a constant reminder that divine justice, though sometimes delayed, is ultimately inescapable. The giants they fathered have been destroyed, their corrupted civilization swept away by the flood, but the spiritual consequences of their rebellion continue to influence human affairs through the demons that are their spiritual legacy. In our next exploration, we will examine how these wandering spirits of the dead Nephilim became the demons that have plagued humanity throughout history, carrying forward the corruption introduced by their angelic ancestors into every generation of human civilization. In the shadowed corridors of ancient theology and mystical tradition, few questions have haunted humanity as persistently as the origin of demonic forces. While mainstream religious doctrine often provides simplified explanations for the existence of evil spirits, a deeper examination of ancient texts reveals a far more complex and disturbing narrative. The connection between the fallen Nephilim and the demonic realm represents one of the most profound theological mysteries of our time. A mystery that bridges the gap between the physical destruction of giants and the spiritual warfare that continues to plague humanity. The traditional understanding of demons as merely fallen angels falls short when confronted with the wealth of ancient testimonies that describe a different origin entirely. These sources point to a more immediate and terrifying source: the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim giants who perished in the Great Flood, condemned to wander the earth as restless, vengeful entities seeking to reclaim what they believe is rightfully theirs. The first book of Enoch, though excluded from the biblical canon, provides the most detailed account of this transformation from giant to demon. In chapters 15 and 16, Enoch receives a divine revelation that fundamentally alters our understanding of the demonic realm. The text explicitly states that the spirits of the Nephilim, being of mixed divine and human origin, cannot find rest in death as pure human souls do. According to this ancient testimony, when the physical bodies of the Nephilim were destroyed, their spirits, carrying the corrupted essence of their angelic fathers, were denied entry into the afterlife. Neither fully divine nor fully human, these entities became trapped in a liminal state, forever wandering between the physical and spiritual realms. This unique ontological status created beings of immense power and eternal frustration, driven by an insatiable hunger to inhabit physical forms once again. The text describes these spirits as evil spirits that shall rise up against the children of men and against the women because they have proceeded from them. This passage suggests that the demons plaguing humanity are not abstract forces of evil, but the actual spirits of beings who once walked the earth as physical giants. Their intimate knowledge of human nature, combined with their supernatural abilities inherited from their angelic lineage, makes them particularly effective adversaries. Understanding how the Nephilim became demons requires examining the unique nature of their hybrid existence. Ancient sources describe the Nephilim as possessing both the divine spark inherited from their Watcher fathers and the mortal flesh received from their human mothers. This combination created beings of unprecedented power, but also of fundamental instability. When the flood waters destroyed their physical forms, the divine component of their nature prevented their spirits from following the normal path of human souls. Yet their human component barred them from returning to the heavenly realm. Caught between these two destinies, the Nephilim spirits became corrupted by their own impossible existence, transforming from merely powerful beings into actively malevolent entities. This transformation was not instantaneous, but represents a gradual corruption born of rage, frustration, and an consuming desire for revenge. The ancient texts describe how these spirits, witnessing the destruction of their civilization and the judgment upon their fathers, developed an intense hatred for both God and humanity. They blamed humans for their mother's seduction of the Watchers, and they blamed the divine realm for their father's punishment and their own cursed existence. The result was the birth of a new category of evil, demons who possessed intimate knowledge of both human weakness and divine power, combined with an eternal grudge against all creation. Unlike the fallen angels, who at least maintained their original celestial nature, the Nephilim spirits became something entirely new, beings designed for destruction and dedicated to the corruption of everything they could not possess. The connection between Nephilim and demons explains many of the characteristic behaviors attributed to demonic entities throughout history. Ancient accounts consistently describe demons as beings obsessed with possession, not merely of human bodies, but of entire territories, bloodlines, and civilizations. This behavior perfectly mirrors what we know of the Nephilim's original nature as conquerors and rulers who viewed humans as subjects to be dominated. The superior knowledge demons display regarding human psychology and weakness stems from their origin as beings who were once part human themselves. Having experienced physical existence, hunger, desire, and mortality, these spirits understand human nature from the inside out. They know precisely which temptations will prove most effective, which fears will paralyze their victims, and which desires can be twisted into destructive obsessions. Furthermore, the immense physical strength, often attributed to demonic manifestations, finds its explanation in the original nature of the Nephilim as giants of extraordinary power. Though they no longer possess physical bodies, their spiritual essence retains the memory and capacity of their former strength. When they manage to inhabit or influence physical matter, they can channel something approximating their original gigantic power. The hierarchical organization of demons, as described in various grimoires and ancient texts, also reflects the social structure of Nephilim civilization. Just as the giants established kingdoms and ruling dynasties, their spiritual descendants maintain complex hierarchies of power and territory. The princes and kings of the demonic realm are not merely titles, but represent the spirits of actual Nephilim rulers who continue to command their subjects even in their disembodied state. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence linking demons to the Nephilim lies in the geographical distribution of demonic activity throughout history. Ancient sources consistently identify certain locations as particularly prone to supernatural disturbances, locations that correspond remarkably with archaeological sites associated with giant civilizations. The Mediterranean region, the Middle East, and parts of North America all show evidence of both ancient giant cultures and persistent demonic activity. This is not coincidental, but represents the spiritual footprint of the Nephilim civilization. These spirits remain bound to the territories where they once ruled, unable to fully depart from the scenes of their former glory. Traditional exorcism practices from various cultures recognize this territorial aspect of demonic activity. Native American shamanic traditions speak of locations where ancient enemies still dwell, requiring specific rituals to cleanse or appease these entities. European folklore describes certain castles, forests, and ruins as perpetually haunted by giants' ghosts, or old gods, who refuse to accept their defeat. Archaeological evidence supports these claims through the discovery of massive stone structures, oversized artifacts, and burial sites that suggest the presence of unusually large humanoid beings. Significantly, these same locations often become centers of persistent supernatural activity that local populations learn to avoid or approach only with elaborate protective rituals. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Nephilim demon connection is the possibility of partial reincarnation. Ancient texts suggest that these spirits continuously seek to regain physical form through various means, including possession, genetic manipulation, and even direct materialization under specific circumstances. The phenomenon of demonic possession takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. Rather than simple spiritual oppression, possession becomes an attempt by Nephilim spirits to reclaim physical existence. The extraordinary strength often displayed by possessed individuals, their resistance to normal physical constraints, and their displays of knowledge they should not possess, all point to inhabitation by entities who once possessed superhuman physical capabilities. More controversial are accounts throughout history of demons actually manifesting in partially physical forms. Medieval grimoires describe summoned entities appearing as giants or beings of enormous stature. Modern UFO encounters often involve beings described as unusually tall, powerful, and displaying capabilities that transcend normal physical limitations. While such accounts must be evaluated carefully, they raise the possibility that Nephilim spirits can, under certain conditions, achieve temporary physical manifestation. The implications of this possibility are staggering. If the spirits of the ancient giants retain the ability to take physical form, even temporarily, then the line between ancient history and contemporary supernatural activity becomes far more permeable than most people imagine. The restless spirits of the Nephilim may not be relegated to the past, but could represent an ongoing threat that adapts to each new age. The transformation of the Nephilim into demons raises profound questions about divine justice and the nature of spiritual existence. Traditional theology struggles to explain why God would allow such powerful evil entities to continue existing if they could simply be destroyed or contained. The Nephilim-demon connection provides a possible answer. These entities represent the natural consequence of the original transgression, a consequence that must be allowed to play out according to spiritual law. The mixed nature of the Nephilim created beings who existed outside normal categories of creation. Neither fully angelic nor fully human, they represent a category of existence that divine law was not designed to accommodate. Their transformation into demons may represent not active divine punishment, but the inevitable result of their impossible ontological status. This understanding suggests that the spiritual warfare between good and evil is not merely an abstract conflict, but a very real struggle against entities who have personal reasons for their hatred of humanity and divine order. The demons plaguing humanity are not random forces of chaos, but the specific spirits of beings who once ruled the earth and who view current human civilization as an illegitimate occupation of their rightful domain. The legacy of the Nephilim as demons extends far beyond individual cases of possession or supernatural manifestation. Ancient sources suggest that these entities work systematically to corrupt human civilization, seeking to recreate the conditions that allowed their original incarnation. This includes promoting the very sins that led to the Watcher's fall: forbidden knowledge, genetic manipulation, and the breakdown of divine order. Modern conspiracy theories about secret societies, genetic experimentation, and supernatural influence on world events may unknowingly point to the continuing activities of these ancient entities. If the Nephilim spirits retain their original intelligence and ambition, they would naturally seek to influence human civilization toward goals that serve their purposes, particularly the recreation of conditions that might allow their full return to physical existence. The proliferation of occult practices, genetic engineering, and transhumanist philosophies in contemporary society takes on ominous significance when viewed through this lens. These developments may represent not human innovation, but the subtle influence of entities who seek to blur the lines between human and divine, natural and artificial, mortal and immortal. The same boundaries whose violation originally created the Nephilim. The connection between the Nephilim and demons transforms our understanding of spiritual warfare from abstract theological concept to concrete historical reality. The evil forces confronting humanity are not merely spiritual principles, but the actual spirits of beings who once walked the earth as physical entities, who remember their glory, and who burn with desire for revenge and restoration. This revelation carries both sobering warnings and empowering insights. The warning is clear: the spiritual forces of evil possess intelligence, memory, and specific goals that make them far more dangerous than random chaos. They know human nature intimately, understand the weaknesses of civilization, and work systematically toward objectives that transcend individual human lifespans. The empowering insight is equally important. These entities, despite their power, remain defeated foes. They were overcome once through divine intervention and the cooperation of righteous humans. Their current form as bodiless spirits represents not victory but exile, a powerful exile but exile nonetheless. Understanding their true nature and origin provides the knowledge necessary to recognize their influence and resist their designs. The restless spirits of the Nephilim continue to haunt humanity, not because they are invincible, but because they refuse to accept their defeat. Their transformation from giants to demons represents both the consequence of ancient sins and the ongoing challenge of spiritual maturity. In recognizing their true nature, humanity takes the first step toward ending their long influence and preparing for whatever final confrontation may yet come. Throughout the annals of human history, certain truths echo across cultures, religions, and civilizations with such consistency that they transcend mere mythology to become prophetic warnings. Among the most persistent of these echoes is the declaration that what has been shall be again, that the giants who once ruled the earth will return in the final days of human civilization. This is not merely the stuff of ancient legend or modern fantasy, but a carefully documented prophetic tradition that spans millennia and crosses cultural boundaries with disturbing precision. The return of the Nephilim represents perhaps the most significant eschatological event yet to unfold, one that will fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself. Ancient texts, modern revelations, and even contemporary scientific developments all point toward a convergence of circumstances that mirrors the conditions preceding the Great Flood. The shadow of the Nephilim, cast backward from their ancient reign and forward from their prophesied return, encompasses our present moment in ways that most of humanity fails to recognize. Understanding this prophetic framework requires more than mere academic study. It demands a willingness to confront the possibility that human history is not a random progression of events, but a carefully orchestrated drama approaching its climactic act. The players in this drama include not only human actors, but supernatural entities whose agenda transcends normal political, economic, or social concerns. The stakes could not be higher. The very definition of what it means to be human hangs in the balance. The foundation for understanding the Nephilim's return lies within the biblical prophetic tradition itself. Jesus Christ's words in Matthew 24:37 provide the clearest indication of this future reality. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. This statement, far from being merely metaphorical, points to a literal restoration of the conditions that necessitated the flood judgment, including the presence of the Nephilim giants. The phrase "as it was" suggests not merely moral similarity, but actual replication of circumstances. The days of Noah were characterized by specific conditions: the corruption of human genetics through angelic intervention, the presence of giants ruling over humanity, unprecedented violence and wickedness, and the breakdown of the natural order itself. For Christ's prophecy to be fulfilled literally, these same conditions must manifest again in the end times. The prophet Daniel provides additional crucial details about this future period. In Daniel 2:43, the mysterious phrase about iron mixed with clay in Nebuchadnezzar's dream has been interpreted by many scholars to refer to the mixing of two different kinds of beings, human and non-human. The text states that they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. This prophetic language strongly suggests a return to the genetic manipulation that characterized the pre-flood world. The book of Genesis itself provides the template for this return in its statement that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, Genesis 6:4. The phrase "and also afterward" has puzzled commentators for centuries, as it seems to suggest that giants survived the flood or would return after it. When combined with other prophetic passages, this phrase takes on ominous significance as a preview of end times conditions. Revelation 9 describes the release of supernatural entities from the abyss during the tribulation period. These beings are described as having characteristics that remarkably parallel ancient descriptions of the Nephilim: great size, immense power, hybrid features combining human and non-human elements, and an agenda of tormenting humanity. While the symbolic language of Revelation makes precise interpretation challenging, the overall picture suggests a return of supernatural beings to direct involvement in human affairs. The shadow of the Nephilim extends across all of human history, from their original appearance through their current spiritual influence to their prophesied return. This shadow represents one of the most significant challenges humanity has ever faced, the potential loss of human nature itself to supernatural corruption and control. Yet the same prophetic tradition that warns of their return also assures their ultimate defeat. The Nephilim's apparent victory will prove temporary, lasting only until divine patience reaches its appointed end. Their return serves not to establish permanent rule, but to demonstrate once and for all the futility of rebellion against divine authority. The final victory belongs not to the giants, but to those who remain faithful to their Creator, despite overwhelming pressure to compromise. These faithful ones, whether they survive physically or not, will inherit a new creation where the corruptions of the past find no place. The shadow of the Nephilim will finally be dispelled by the eternal light of divine truth. In recognizing the signs of their return, we stand at one of history's most crucial junctures. The choices made in our generation will determine not only our own fate, but the conditions under which the final drama of human history unfolds. The shadow of the Nephilim reminds us that this drama is approaching its climax, and that the time for preparation is now. What was will indeed return, but it will not ultimately prevail. The same divine power that ended their first reign will ensure their final defeat. In that assurance lies both warning and hope, warning to prepare for the coming trial, and hope that this trial will mark not the end of human dignity, but its eternal vindication in the kingdom of God.